Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Terry Gilman. I'm the owner of Creating Conversations, and I want to welcome you to our event tonight with Helene Wecker and Mignola. 8 years ago, I fell in love with a book called The Golem and the Jinni. It was published in 2013, and I was honored and fortunate to host Helene Wecker at Mysterious Galaxies 2013 birthday party in San Diego, which is where we first met. Since that time, I've introduced The Golem and the Jinni to all kinds of readers, and I myself have about 4 signed first editions of Golem and the Jinni because that is how much I love this book. So yes, I'm a fan, and I'm thrilled and excited to enter this world again with The Hidden Palace and to host Helene tonight. So The Golem and the Jinni was Helene's debut novel. It was nominated for and received multiple literary prizes. As mentioned, The Hidden Palace is her second novel in this world and in this series. Talk more about that later. Helene lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and her 2 children. And her fun fact, because I always want to know something that nobody else knows, is that she collects fountain pens and she actually uses them. So she doesn't just collect them to look at them. And sometime in the future, she wants to raise chickens. And that has been quite the topic of conversation between our authors over the last couple of days. More about that later. Also with us tonight is another fan of Helene's. Mignola and Helene have met soon after the publication of The Golem and the Jinni, and they have been friends from afar ever since. They at once recognized their mutual appreciation for building fantasy worlds and other things of which I don't even understand that they talk about. So I will leave that to them. As you probably know, Mike is the author and artist of the Hellboy series, first published in 1994. He has written way too many books and graphic novels to name, and I even challenge him to name them all. He has also worked as a visual consultant on a bunch of movies, including his own 2 Hellboy movies. Mike lives in Southern California with his wife, not his daughter anymore, I don't think, and I'm not sure about the cat either, Mike. We didn't really talk about that. And he lives actually right across the street from me. His fun fact is that he lives in LA, but he doesn't drive, but he managed to make it work. So without further ado, please welcome our authors.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Mike.
Hello. Hello.
How are you this fine evening?
I'm fine.
Good. Good.
So how do we start?
I think we start by mutual admiration and saying, I don't know, the things that brought us together and how was it that we came to know each other, which was bizarrely, although maybe not bizarrely these days, over Facebook, that I had posted something about coming to LA after the first after the first book was published way back in 2013, and like the day after I had like posted what I was going to do, where I was going to be reading, whatever, you posted like a reply to it and said basically, drat, I'm not going, I missed it. And I had this moment sitting in my house.
There's no way I said drat.
Okay, fine.
But,
you probably said, damn it. Okay.
Yeah,
but
probably.
So I'm looking at this and I'm looking, I'm like, Mike Mignola. This can't be Mike Mignola. I think it's Mike Mignola. And so I like, you know, I did the drill in on your a profile or whatever, and I'm like, oh wait, oh my god, it's my, and I like literally stood up and like started pacing around the office. I was like, Mike Mignola likes my book, Mike Mignola likes my book, Mike Mignola likes my book, and it was just like this mantra that just sort of was in my head for about the next hour before I worked up the courage to write back and say, gee, I'm sorry. I'll let you know personally next time. And at that point, you told me you were going to be in town for something, and we like met in Berkeley and had lunch, and that was that, I think.
And you said that now we're pals.
Yes, I said we were pals now.
Yeah, and then I didn't. Yeah, that it was great. And I got to say, I never expect anybody to know who I am. So the weirdest thing was when you went, you're like, "Are you the Mike Mignola?" And I'm like, "Well, there aren't many of us.
I'm a Mike Mignola."
Yeah. So it's So yeah, that's it. And I love the book. I'll segue into actually talking about the book if I can.
Mhm.
I used to read a lot of fantasy, and I don't read very much anymore, but I read more historical fiction. And I think maybe what works so well, and I just reread it, what works so well about the first book is that it read like a historical novel as much, if not more, than a fantasy novel. So I'm kind of curious, was that the intention? Because what it felt like is somebody wanted to write about old New York and how all these different cultures lived right smack next to each other downtown.
Mhm.
And you kind of just use these fantasy characters plopped into that to talk about what that world was.
Basically, okay, so taking it back to like the very beginning of how this series started was that I was getting my master's in fiction at Columbia in New York, and it was, no one had ever like said to me, people talk about gatekeeping and all of that, and no one had ever said to me, okay, you're at Columbia, you can't write sci-fi and fantasy anymore. I had just sort of like taken on the milieu of like, okay, I am come to New York, I am here to write seriously, and that means serious stories that took place in a serious world that happened seriously, where everything was real. And so what I was writing about, what really interested me, was like my family history stories and my husband's family's history stories. And that we had gotten together when I was 18 and he was 20. And we had grown up like 40 minutes away from each other in suburban Chicago. I'm Jewish, he's Arab American. And so, but we didn't meet till we got to college in Minnesota. But as I gotten to know him and know his family, it had struck me how similar our family histories were around issues of coming to the US and the whole immigration story, and his father having to learn English when he came here in his 20s, and my dad coming to the US as a Yiddish speaking child. And it all just sort of had been brewing around in my head for years. But when I put these stories down on paper for like my workshop, they just fell flat. And it was like I was telling stories that I knew already, and so I wasn't discovering them as I wrote them. And a couple of them turned out okay. One or two of them actually made it to publication in various places, but the rest of them, it was like I'm just not feeling it, and the comments I was getting back from the people who are reading, or they weren't feeling it either. So I was complaining about it to a friend of mine who was in the workshop, and she basically like took me to task, and she said, why are you not writing? Why aren't you using fantasy? Why aren't you like making it fantastical? That's what I've been to your apartment. I've seen your bookshelf. I know what you love. I know what you talk about in class. You are always going on and on and on about the uses of fantasy and folklore and fiction and so on and so forth. That's your whole thing. So why aren't you doing that? And what happened then was I just sort of went, it just sort of like blew my head back. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I could. And she said, the next thing, she said, you need to take a break from all of this stuff. Write something. You can make it about your families, fine, whatever, but make it fantastical. And that's what I want to see from you next workshop. It's like, okay. I take orders really well, apparently. So I went back to my apartment, and literally by the end of the day, I'd written the first 12 pages of what became the Golem and the Jinni. And it was like, okay, so if I'm doing this, if I'm going to do this, what, instead of like the Jewish girl and the Arab American boy who've been sort of weaving around through my stories, what if I make them into like the most emblematic folkloric creature from each culture? What if I make them a golem, a girl golem, I guess, since I'm a girl, and a boy genie? And at that point, it was like they just sort of appeared in front of me, and I was like, okay, so where are you guys? Like, are you? And I was like, you've got to be in Manhattan, and you're probably at the turn of the 20th century, because like the little that I knew at that point was that, like the heyday of immigration from, from Jewish Europe, and also, as I sort of knew, but really learned later from like what was then Syria, but is now Lebanon, was around the turn of the 20th century. So it's like, okay, so you guys are in 1899 Manhattan. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to pump out a short story. And that was the beginning of it. And it got longer and longer and longer. And as it got longer, I needed to know more. And my readers were telling me, okay, this is better than anything you've given us until now. So thank you. But we really want more detail. And the fun of the story is in figuring out how these two immigrants to humanity are learning about things like, how do I get a job and an apartment, and what is this thing, what's that thing, what am I doing here? And so in order to really tell that story at like the detail level, I had to learn about Manhattan at the turn of the 20th century, and just like a baseline of how did people live, what did people eat, what did people, how did you get up in the morning, did you have an alarm clock, just all the silly little stuff. And so it became about wanting to know what historical New York was like at the turn of the 20th century, but I backed myself into that in a way that I absolutely had not planned. But once I got, sorry.
You really lucked out also in that you had two such fantastic folklore characters to deal with. I mean, really, I've been fascinated by Golem forever.
Mm-hmm.
And Jinni, I didn't know anything about really, except for the stereotypical thing. Plus, New York at that time, which you cover really well in the book, is there's not just the fact that you have this melting pot downtown, but downtown is an entirely different planet from uptown New York. So the fact that these characters are in right next to each other downtown, there's also this entire other New York, which you had to research the hell out of, that they get to explore.
Yeah. And, learning about how, I mean, even, more today too, but so much more so back then, each immigrant group had its own, like maybe 4 to 8 square blocks of New York. And you could live your entire life in those 4 to 8 square blocks and speak your own language and not even have to learn English to some extent. And, just so many of those like shoulder to shoulder, and learning how, just how people got by, how, and then thinking about it, like you said, from the point of view of these folkloric creatures who who came with their own myth on top of like the all of the cultural stuff that came along with that. It's like, okay, so I've got not just a Jew, but a Jewish golem, and with that comes issues of servitude and violence and these like the Frankenstein story, basically, like that we've, you know, what if human but not quite, and everything that comes along with that. That is just, you know, a continuum of stories from, you know, midrash or all the way back to you know, myth, you know, ancient myth, all the way through to science fiction, and, you know, Commander Data on Star Trek. And, you know, I'm reading right now the Murderbot Diaries by her name is Martha Wells, and it's the same thing. It's that, like, you know, someone who is created to be a tool for humans, who acquires sort of not just sentience but agency and self-ownership, and what happens then, and what do you do with that. And so it just felt like everything opened up and I could do whatever I wanted, and that was sort of terrifying. And it led me down all sorts of blind alleys because I just got interested in everything. I have this like magpie mind that wants to grab onto everything and hold on to it and learn about everything. And everything that I was studying at any given time was like, oh, well, this is the focus of the book now. And the same thing happened with the second. And I can only imagine that it's going to happen again when I try to write book number 3. But and my family will just have to live with me, deal with it. Yes.
book number 3. Yay.
Yes. Hopefully it won't kill me.
So let me look at my notes. So when you wrote the first book, did you know how much bigger it was? Did you know? At what point in the first book did you know there was a second book? Or did you somehow think this is the story? Because I know sometimes you create these characters and you say, that's it for you. And the characters go, no, I have this whole other thing.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I had thought back when I was thinking it was still a short story, or maybe a YA novel, I thought something short, was that I was going to tell their story from 1900 up to the modern time. And it was just going to be like checking in with them every few years, the way like in Neil Gaiman's Sandman, how Dream and forgetting the character's name. There's a character who's basically immortal, and he and Dream every 100 years catch up. And that was going to be how it was going to be for the two of them. Like every 5 or 10 years, they were going to meet in a park and talk. And that fell to the side pretty quickly. Once it became more about like the day-to-day of their lives, I was like, okay, it's Damien just put it in the chat. Hobgolding. Yes, thank you, Damien. I saw you here earlier. I'm so glad you made it. Anyway, so right. So and that idea of how the book was going to work fell apart like super fast. But it had sort of primed me to think about them through the various decades and through up to modern time, and how they would react to people changing around them, and to you know, society sort of moving on. The two of them are just sort of as they are. So I think by the time I reached the end of the first book, they'd always sort of struck me as two characters who just keep going on. You know, and people are like, are you going to kill them off? And I'm like, I don't think so, not yet. I mean, it would be a good way to stop the series, is if the two of them just die, but I don't feel like doing that.
I know from experience, you can kill a character off, especially if you've got supernatural characters, and it tends to make them more interesting. So yeah. Try killing them off. They're going to come back.
Yep.
Yes. Did they, I know reading it, it seems like there are various points where I go, oh, I love the way this character is now. Don't change them. Is there a part of you that wanted to keep them? There's a certain innocence at some point, and then, like children, they tend to grow up, and sometimes they grow up in ways you didn't expect. So did that happen?
I'm going to
or did you kind of know the arc of these guys?
Now I'm curious, what point was it that do you remember what point it was where you're like, oh, don't change? Because I'm just curious now.
Well, it's more fun to write like Hellboy stories
Uh-huh.
before he became the Beast of the Apocalypse, when he was just a guy.
Yeah.
And as soon as that thing happened where I set him on a track and he had to go someplace, I knew that he had to go there,
Mm-hmm.
but I kind of felt bad for, thank God I had built in this giant 50-year thing that I could play with when it was innocent times.
Yeah.
But once he's on that track and he's going someplace,
It's
I've always felt with these kind of characters, you need to give them enough room to go where they're gonna go. It seems weird because I'm an artist more than I'm a writer. So when I started writing, I felt it was very strange when these characters do take on a life of their own, and that you have to kind of let them, to a certain extent. You can kind of try to steer them, but you can't nail them down. And you got to let them go where they go, and
Yeah.
hope for the best.
That was, I think, especially the second book, I was thinking about especially Chava as like, okay, at the beginning of this book, she is 1 year old, basically. She has been among humans for a year. She has been alive for a year, and it was a very tumultuous year. And I just had this feeling of like the first few years out of college, when you think you know what you're doing, and you've got life figured out, you are paying your own rent, you are maybe you've even got a job that's got at a place with a logo, where you got a shirt with the logo on it. That's what I did. And now you've got it made, and you know what you're doing, and how then life can just sort of kneecap you slowly or quickly, and everything just sort of gets called into question. And that was how I felt about this book. It was the two of them growing up, and them growing up together, and having to learn about the things that they were either denying themselves or denying that mattered to them. Like in this book, Ahmad, in the first book, he's been captured, and basically and released pretty accidentally in New York, 1,000 years after he was captured, on the other side of the world from where he used to live, and now he's stuck in human form. He's here basically by, not of his own free will. And the thing that's sort of a saving grace for him in the first book is that he thinks the city is really interesting. And oh, here's this clay woman, she seems interesting too. So the first book is them just getting to know each other and adjusting to their current situation. But then what happens when, like, the excitement of that falls away, when they've gotten over the plot of the first book and the evil has been dealt with, and now it's like the aftermath, and they have actual time to sit and digest what their current situations are and what's going on with them. And it became, for him especially, about like having to admit to himself that he misses who he used to be, and that this is something that he can't share with Chava, with the woman that he has like now come to love. He can't even speak his own language anymore. He can't, he has no one, there are no other jinn in the world. And for her, she's like, I'm the only golem that I know of. And so that is, something that he's dealing with that she isn't. And so they sort of like, they don't admit to themselves these things that are like very, very influential, that just sort of start pulling them apart. And so, yeah, it really was about them sort of growing up and becoming their own people in that way.
I can't be the only reader that was saying, to him, no, it's fine. Stay in New York. Don't go. About the jinn, how much of that, which we get so much more of in the second book, how much of that is folklore and how much of that is your invention? Because there's a lot of that world.
A bunch of it's my own invention. it's sort of tricky because it's like, okay, jinn are a fact of life for a lot of Muslims today. Like, it's just part of the world in the way that angels and demons and heaven and hell are a fact of life for many Christians and Muslims today, and Jews to some extent, but not the Jews I grew up with. And so it's like, it's just the other world. It's this other part of reality that is very much real, but sort of like beyond the veil. And so, and since, you know, as Islam and as like the folklore have spread through the world and through the Arab Muslim world, all these different regions have developed all their own myths and stories, and you know, methods for dealing with, you know, exorcism and you know, prayers, and just sort of, this is a thing you have to deal with, is you move to a new place, you got to set out something for the jinn and let them know that, you know, they're there, and then they just, you know, then you just, you know, agree to ignore each other. Okay, fine. So as I'm reading all these stories, it's like, okay, well, I have to decide on my own version of this. And my own version was going to be that, you know, jinn live in these sort of conglomerations in the desert, and they in that they the thing about iron is true to myth, to many versions of it, in sort of the same way that fairies and the fae in British and you know, European myth have like the iron allergy, which is fascinating, and I know whole articles and books have been written about it. But so I took pieces and glued them together with my own stuff and sort of situated it in the historical world that was pretty close to the real historical world, but with bits that I had either added or changed. And I sort of had to just admit to myself at some point that I was making my own version of it, in the way that any writer has to make their own version of it, just for sake of consistency. You know, I had to create rules. And so, you know, my rules were allergic to iron and can't stand water, both of which have, you know, backup in the old myths and the old stories. In some of them, it's just that I sort of pulled together my own version of it.
The beauty is, I think, with both the golem and the jinn, is that while you kind of made your own rules and you kind of you never really explained them. The beauty is you didn't explain them too much. It is my biggest problem with you know, when fantasy becomes science fiction.
Yep.
When there's too many rules.
Yep.
When you've got your concrete rules for a vampire, you know, you have to kill them by doing X, Y, and Z, and in 3 days they raise from the grave. It's like all that.
When you hear
too
the
many
dice
rules
rolling off screen, it's like, oh, come on, like, you know, yeah.
Yeah, so that's great. With the sequel, and I don't want to give anything away, but a lot of characters that I thought you were kind of done with. Did you just have a whole laundry list of, oh crap, I gotta say what happens to her, and I gotta say what happens to him, and then plus, oh, let's have this slew of new guys show up. Is that part of why it took so long? Because you realized, oh God, there's a lot more I's to dot.
But well, okay, so maybe some of that. What I had a, you know, Dickensian character list in the first one, and looking at the second one, it was like, okay, it wasn't that I felt like I had to fill a role, like I had to continue every story. It was these people, you know, these characters I can bring back to fill certain roles. You know, I have to figure out what the plot is and bring back characters as I see fit in order to advance the plot along. But at the beginning of that process, I had completely different characters than what ended up being in the final version of the book. There's a character in the first book, Matthew, who we leave him. He's a boy from Little Syria. He doesn't talk a lot, but he becomes sort of like the Jinni's sidekick by the end of the first book in a way. And we see him at the end of the first book going back to Syria. And I was 100% certain he was going to be in the second book. He was going to come back to the US and run a Nickelodeon, a picture theater. And he was in Little Syria, and we were going to like watch him grow up and fall in love and so on. And he was in that version of it for like a good 2-3 years. And finally I had to cut him out because I realized all he was doing was weighing the book down, and I wanted to know his story, but that didn't mean it belonged in the book. So I had to take it out because all it was doing was just creating a ton of problems and not really adding anything. And in his place, I put in Toby. Toby is the son of one of the main characters from the first book. We see her basically, he appears at the very, very end in the epilogue as an infant. And so in this book, which spans 15 years as opposed to the 1 year of the first book, we see him grow up, and he becomes a bicycle messenger for Western Union. He's like a telegram boy. And it is his job to ride around Manhattan in the service of the plot, pulling different threads together as he delivers messages and takes them to other places. And in the first version where Matthew was like front and center, Toby and his mom had moved upstate, and they were like somewhere else, and Chava would get letters from them every once in a while. And so once Matthew was lifted out of the story, along with like half of the other plot, because I had just burdened this poor book with so much, I was like, okay, what am I going to do to weave everything together? My husband, as I'm like taking all of this plot out of the book, my husband later said, it was sort of like in Predator, where the predator just takes the spine and rips it out of the guy. That's what you did to your book. I was like, yeah, it pretty much is what I did to my book. And so I had to bring something in that was going to weave it together. And so I just looked at my character list, and I was like, well, Toby, we'll make Toby a messenger boy, and he will do that work. And so I hadn't expected to know anything about Toby, but then suddenly there he was. And for the other characters, like you said, okay, there's another golem, there's another Jinni, and it sort of does feel like, okay, this is the sequel, and so you've got to double it and raise the stakes. And so that, I was like, oh, okay, yes. But I knew from the beginning, and this is like one of the few things that really did carry through from the beginning to the end of writing this book, that it was going to be about the assimilation process. It was going to be about the thought of adapting to America, and how much is enough and how much is too much. And at what point do you feel like you are not even the person who came over? And so I knew it was going to have that longer time span. And I was like, okay, so how is it going to be? How are we going to like bring our two main characters up against how much they've changed? And I was like, well, the best way to do that would be to sort of put a mirror up to like their purest form of like, for Yasala, the new golem that I introduced, he's very much sort of the golem of myth and story. He is the protector. He is large and powerful, and does not look human in the least, and is built to defend, and not terribly bright.
And is amazingly sad.
Yes.
He's amazingly sad.
I did not mean for him to be the heart tugger.
He made me cry twice.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, it's what I was looking for. It's exactly what I was looking for. Yeah, he's
such a heartbreaker. He really is, and I didn't mean him to be. But by the end, I was like, oh.
And I don't want to give away where he ends up.
Yeah,
that was just
okay.
Forget about
okay.
it. That was perfect.
Sorry.
Perfect. It was perfect.
And then on the other side of that is Dima, who is the Jinni, the female Jinni, and
she was just a bitch.
Oh yeah, yeah, she
Yeah.
was absolutely. And I have a hard time writing bitches.
Well, you did it well.
Okay, I'm glad you think so, because she, I mean, just sort of amoral and self-centered in a very in that elemental, literally elemental sort of way. Like a fire doesn't give a shit when it burns down. Like it's just, but how do you make that sympathetic?
I was begging you to kill her. There were like 3 different times where I was like, oh, thank God she's dead.
Nope. Well, okay, I'm not giving anything away, but no, because she's fascinating too in her own way. She was the trickiest character to write. She was the hardest to pin down. And I think partly it's because I am just allergic to like the sort of behavior that she does. And so I kept wanting to pull back and be like, no, I want to make her nicer, like as a reflex. And then I would have to remind myself, no, that is not what she is. She doesn't care about you, Helene. She does not care about your feelings.
Right.
She doesn't care about how, you perceive her. She is doing her own thing, and she has.
Well, it's a non-human perspective. It's like writing a wild animal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that's what Ahmad has to come up against too, is like, he's, when he sees what she is, he's like, oh yeah, that's what I used to be. And then the question becomes, what does he do with that perception, with that information? Does he, he's sort of on a knife's edge at that point, and you could fall either way. And so having to work the characters to the part where that feels like the organic place where they end up together, that was the thing that took so damn long. And I am proud of where this book ended up. I should say that. There were years where I was like, this isn't working. This isn't going to work. I'm going to have to give the advance back. It's just not going to work. I'm going to have to raise my chickens in the garden with the vegetables. I had a whole plan, and my husband was like, no, you're not raising chickens. You are going to finish this book. And I didn't believe it for years. And then it finally happened. So
you finished the book, but you still get chickens?
I might still get chickens. We'll see.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Boy, it just works. And just the simple, the geography and the math of the second book. The fact that you cover so much of New York, you have to know what New York is like at that time. And apparently you have to know by bicycle how long it takes to get from downtown to uptown. I don't know how much of that is research and how much of that is guesswork. I
never bicycle. Oh, I fear for my life too much to bicycle from uptown to downtown in New York. But I tried to read like accounts of the bicycle messengers and how how much they would ride per day, and I tried to do my best to make a guesstimation, but God only knows. Don't time it, please.
You made a wonderful observation about the delivery, the messenger boy, that they're invisible, because like so many people who have those kinds of jobs in New York, you don't see them, which I thought was fascinating, because I mean, I lived in New York for years, and it's really true. There's certain people, they might as well be just a machine, and you don't register them as human beings.
Mm-hmm. They're part of the workings of the city, like everything else. They just make things run. And so you don't see the individual boy, you see the uniform. And that was, there was a professor whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. I actually credit him in the acknowledgements, so you can look it up if you've got the book, but he's like the definitive researcher on the world of telegram boys around the turn of the century through the 30s. And
somebody's got to be.
Yes, exactly. Like every subject, someone is like, this is my thing, and I'm gonna, I gotta find them and whatever. But just how like every door opened to them, and they were like these kids who were like 11 years old, and they're going to, you know, City Hall, and they're just walking up and down the halls delivering telegrams, and they can go to Fifth Avenue and go inside the mansions. And it's like, and they're from the tenements, and they're seeing this world that is absolutely close to them, except for the tiny little bubble that they live in because they've got this hat with a badge on it. And it's just fascinating. And that's the sort of stuff I could write all day.
Well, how many characters, how much stuff that you took out of the first book won't go away? The stuff that says, well, I either get my own book or you find a way to put me in the next one. Because I know that's what my career for the last 25 years has been. I'm done with you. And then the guy says, no, 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 I want my own series.
Yeah. Matthew, the guy, the boy who went back to Syria, I have just chapters on him, and like learning so much about Lebanese and Syrian history, and just tragedy after tragedy, and just wanting to tell the story of the country through him. Sort of, I feel like, I mean, not like, but on the other hand, I'm like, who the hell am I? I'm not Lebanese. I'm not, you know, I don't own this. I don't know any of this stuff by heart, the way that, you know, I mean, by heart, like beating painful heart, the way that so many Lebanese, you know, are. But at the same time, it's like, I've got all this stuff and it's so good, and I wanna like get it out in the world. So I don't know if that's going to be in the next book. The other one was an Irish cop who was going to be in this book and was part of like the spine that I pulled out. And he was the only other, people ask me, what other mythologies do you know, want to dabble in and whatever. And I told sort of incidentally the Selkie myth through him, of like the seal that like, you know, takes off its skin and becomes human and walks on land, just incidentally. And it was about, again, that sense of having to fit in and wear a skin that is not yours. And
because an Irish cop who has a seal skin in his trunk at home and somebody shows up looking for it, that's a book.
I'm not gonna say anything, but but this guy like stole my heart away from the moment I like put him down on paper, and I wanted, and he ended up he's sitting in a file. He's just sitting there waiting for me. So I don't know what I'm going to do with him, but he's out there.
When we met, you were talking about the second Golem and the Jinn book, but you were also talking about a couple other books you were going to write.
You remember this? Oh my God.
Oh, no, I had a really good time. Did the other books kind of get pushed further into the background as you say, this looks like my world for a while? The guy who did the comic book Concrete said to me at one point he realized that Concrete was his life's work, not that he would do nothing but that comic, but that he realized at some point he was never going to do anything on that scale. And you know, I know what that feels like.
You're telling me that this is my obituary.
I'm not saying
this is what
you've got plenty of years, but
no, but it's absolute. I read this. You're reminding me of this interview I read with Lin-Manuel Miranda, where this was like a couple years after Hamilton was, you know, had just blown the world away. And they were, you know, someone asked him, so what are you going to do now? And he said, anything I want. He said, because I know what my obituary is going to be when I die. The first line is going to be, Lin-Manuel Miranda, creator of the musical Hamilton, has passed away. And he said, that's enough. That's plenty. That's what it is. And now I get to do, you know, maybe I'll go back to that. Maybe I won't. Maybe someone else will make me do, you know, get me to do something else. And I think about like so many authors who, oh God, why am I blanking on his name? Who did Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Oh yeah.
And how Douglas Adams, and how like I remember someone basically slagging off on him that he never really did anything else besides that and the Dirk Gently books. And it's like, dude, that's an amazing series. You brought so much joy into the world. Like, and you know,
Well,
what?
like I always say, when people say, well, can you give us your short bio? I said, Mike Mignola is the creator of Hellboy.
Yeah,
It's a wonderful relief to
yeah,
have that and say,
yeah,
oh yeah, and then he did some other stuff.
yeah.
Um,
And you got a kid and you got like
I,
a
I don't
house
feel the
and a
need to
cat,
top
apparently.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, don't need to top it. I can do other stuff, but
yeah.
you've got the one under your belt that works.
It's like, okay, this is my beat. I know my beat. I know my lane. This is like the place where I'm making my home, and that's fine. And maybe I'll do something else someday, and maybe I won't. And maybe I will just grow vegetables and take care of my kids. And that's
And
fine too.
if you love that world,
Yeah.
it is one of those things. I think so many people feel obligated to do something else or to compete with it or have a bigger success or have a second thing that's as big a success as that first thing. But my feeling is, yeah, if you've got one,
Yeah.
I mean, you can play, but it's one thing if you have that one successful thing and you hated doing it, but everybody says you got to keep doing it. Kill Sherlock Holmes, but you got to come back, and because that's all that anybody wants.
Well, that was the corporate job that I had for 7 years that everyone said I wrote the best press releases. And I'm like, oh my God, kill me if I'm going to write another press release. So yeah, I mean, you do your thing. God, we should all get the one thing that we do that we're good at and that we love to do. And so, yeah.
So you deserve your chickens.
I deserve my chickens, damn it.
That's right.
So now that we're back to chickens, I'm going to just see if anyone in the audience has a question for the two of you. Otherwise, I will let the chicken conversation continue.
We may have talked that one out, but
yeah,
they have. Damien, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Damien.
There we go. There we go. Hey, thank you both for this conversation. Is really fantastic. And I love hearing both of you talk about this. Mike Mignola asked part of the question that I wanted to ask earlier, which was how much of your mythology for these two was built from your own. But I wanted to also ask a bit more in that space, like in terms of how much background research did you do into the world, into the mythologies of both golem writing, golem work, and Jinn mythologies. I have a deep and abiding interest in both. So I just wanted to see where you were pulling from, and if you found anything in your research that was surprising to you.
Oh. For Jinn, I knew very little, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't stepping on toes and being a blundering idiot. So I read a lot. I read as much as I could. I read like translations of 1001 Nights. I read oh my God, I went on JSTOR and I looked up, compendiums of like folklore that, collected by, ethnographers at the turn of the 20th century, having to keep in mind that, my main problem is I don't know Arabic, and I couldn't go to like the main sources. And so everything was in translation. And so I took everything with a giant grain of salt, and had to sort of reverse engineer the white idiocy out of it as much as I could. But at some point, just that realization of, okay, there are 8,000 different versions and there is no one way to get it right. So I'm going to have to exercise my authorial whatever and just choose at some point. For golems, the funny, people ask me, when did you first learn about golems? And I have no idea. I never had like the formative golem story. I never learned golem stories through my parents or my grandparents. They never told me stories. It was like, that's all old country, and they didn't want to think about it. And they weren't they didn't talk about that stuff. And so I don't even know, it must have been like some story I heard at Sunday school or something. But the first female golem, that was the thing that like people were like, you did the first female golem. I'm like, oh hell no, I didn't. The big female golem is Cynthia Ozick, the Puttermesser papers, and her story of again, New York, the golem in New York, except it's 1960s or 70s, and it's a woman who creates a golem who is basically her daughter but also herself, and it's this very just amazing story. I've only read it recently for the first time because I decided I was finally going to own up and read it, and because I had just been too intimidated to read Cynthia Ozick on golems, I was like, there is no way in hell that I'm going to, you know, feel like I have any authority to write anything about golems after reading Cynthia Ozick, but I finally did it. But the other one, my first female like girl golem was there's a writer named Naomi Kritzer who I actually went to college with, and she has this amazing young adult series that, Terry, you should get it if you don't have it. It's the first book is Catfishing on Catnet, and the second is called Chaos on Catnet. And she's won awards for it and everything. But one of her first short stories that got published was about a lesbian couple in Prague in the 1940s who create a female golem for themselves to protect themselves from the Nazis. And I was like, oh, a girl golem, because it was like, it's such a stereotypically male creature, and the gender role of the golem, and having that turned around, just sort of like, wow. So that was, you know, so she was my first girl golem. And then, so just sort of, I felt a lot freer playing around with the golem stuff, because it was like, okay, I'm Jewish. You know, people can come yell at me all they want. That's fine, you know, but I got to get the Arab American stuff right, because my God, you know.
Well,
so,
do you think you felt more comfortable writing the Jinn stuff because of your husband? Do you
well,
think
I mean,
you
that
would have
was,
gone there if you didn't have somebody from that culture that you could kind of check with?
well, I mean, yes, and that was the reason I was writing about it in the first place, was because
Right.
it all came from that personal relationship. But at the same time, it's like, I'm very cautious about, you know, writing about other cultures, not because because I am afraid. It's afraid to misunderstand, I think, is like when it becomes about, okay, yeah, you got this right, but the implications are all wrong. And it's like, that's the stuff where it's like, okay, you can get something factually correct, but if you're missing what it gets to the heart of, then you didn't do what you set out to do. And so, you know, I was writing from a very personal place, and I didn't want to presume about other people's personal experiences of things. The closest that I could possibly make myself write about was the culture that belongs to the guy that I've been married to for the past however many years. And even that was like, I'm really on thin ice here. I got to be careful. So, so yeah, I mean, and maybe is that being, no, I don't want to say it's me being too sensitive, because I feel like all writers should do that. I've read stuff where it's like someone's just writing about Judaism because they wanted to make their character Jewish for the sake of diversity or whatever, and it's like, yeah, no, you didn't get that right, and it shows, and no, and so I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to pull people out of the story like that.
Okay, we have another question. Mr. Long, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. So that was wonderful. And as a follow-up to that, I was wondering if there were any like books that you really loved on like how fantasy works, you know, things that are more along the sort of literary theory thing direction, like Farah Mendelssohn's Rhetorics of Fantasy. So thank you.
How fantasy works. Good Lord. Let me think about that. Honestly, the first thing that is coming to mind, and this is not what you meant, But the first thing coming to mind is the first book that I ever really fell in love with when I was a little kid. And it was called Myths and Enchantment Tales. And it's a very boulderized version of the Greek and Roman myths. The edition that I had was decorated with these very Art Deco, like lots of vertical, gorgeous falling lines sort of illustrations. And I feel like that was what I trained up on in a way, was this is the bones of a story. This is the bones of a myth. It is Athena coming out of Zeus's head. And then, yes, when you're in college, you'll learn the actuality behind that myth and how it's all very Freudian and blah, blah, blah. But this is how we're going to teach them so that anyone can understand them. And just the language of that, it's almost like a formula. It's almost like a spell, I guess, is what I'm saying, and then they walked into the woods, and then this happened, and then 3 days later, it's all that very codified language and progression. And I really do feel like it was, in a way, sort of like the source code for fantasy, to read this stuff and just sort of over and over and over again. And I didn't mean to, I certainly wasn't meaning to do this when I was like 7 years old, and just drill it into my head of, this is how a story is told. This is how a myth is created. And then to be able to take that and go from there, and just, it's like you plug that in, it gets plugged in somewhere, somehow it's in the source, and you just go with it.
Del Toro and I used to call that fairy tale logic.
Yeah.
Because there's just a certain rhythm to these things that feels right. And you can't necessarily explain it with hard and fast rules, but from reading the stuff, from reading a lot of the stuff, that there's a certain rhythm to that stuff.
Yep.
Which is why I never read anything that analyzes, everybody's always talking about, the golden bough and all that kind of, and I just want to read stories.
Yeah.
And for me, what do they feel like, as opposed to some professor somewhere telling me what they're supposed to mean?
Mm-hmm. And that's why I am not an academic, and you are not an academic. It's like, and part of me has always felt like a failed academic. Like I had at one point pretensions of going to grad school and becoming a professor, an English professor. And I'm so glad that I did, not just because, oh my God, these days what that looks like, but just like, I get to make shit up. I get to do all of that and have all those fun thoughts and whatever, and make shit up at the same time, and someone pays me for it. And it's like, honestly, I mean, yeah, this job makes me want to kill myself 9 days out of 10, but that 10th day is pretty amazing. And I really just love what I get to do when I do it right.
Well, I love that. I love this discussion between the two of you. It was completely priceless. And we've been so honored to have both of you here. We could listen to you for another hour, but we are at the bottom of the hour. And so I do want to close, but I just want to, I also want to give Mike just an opportunity to talk just for 1 second, if he can do that, about what he's been doing over the last 16 months. We know what you've been doing for 8 years, and we certainly hope it's not going to be another 8 years. So Mike, will you just talk for 1 second about your project? And then I'm gonna close this for tonight.
Okay. What you're referring to is when the pandemic started, to entertain myself and people on Facebook, I started just doing drawings, and maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 drawings a day of just whatever the hell I wanted to draw. And after a while, we decided they were stacking up, and we would auction them off on eBay. And we raised a lot of money for Jose Andreas's World Central Kitchen. I figured, it was horrifying to see food lines out there. So we raised a lot of money, and eventually we went to my publisher, and they agreed to do a book of the drawings, and all the proceeds from the book are going to Jose Andres World Central Kitchen.
And
So
I'm
that's
going to
what I
jump
do.
in and say that every single one of those drawings was like the highlight of my Twitter feed when I would be scrolling through. It was like, especially just in the doldrums of the pandemic and all the politics and everything, and it'd be like doom, 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 horrible doom. Oh my God, look at this drawing! That's so cute. That's amazing.
Mr.
And more
Peanut.
doom. And so, like, everyone should get a copy of this. It's
Wow.
just wonderful.
Well,
I
thanks for
feel a
this.
little guilty because people have talked about, oh, you did this great thing. And I'm like, I was just goofing around. So my wife gets all the credit for turning it into something. I was just drawing snap, crackle, and pop because I thought it was funny.
All wives should get all the credit all the time, let me just say. But
That's true.
But thank you, Mike. And we do have a couple copies of what remains in print of the quarantine sketchbook, and Mike will personalize for anyone who would like one. So you can go on our website and buy one, and I'll get it personalized and signed for you. We have just a few limited number of copies. And also we have signed first editions of Helene's latest book. We also have some book plates that go with the first book, Golem and Jinni. Everything is available on our website. And I do want to thank the authors for being here. I want to thank everyone for coming. Your support of an indie bookstore and events business, and your support of these authors means the world to us. And we thank you all so much for coming. So good night.
Good night.
Bye.